Some people walk past a moment that changes their life without ever noticing it. The river reflected the Chicago skyline like shattered glass beneath the late afternoon sun. Cold wind drifted across the water, carrying the scent of rain that had not arrived yet. I sat on the same wooden bench where I had painted nearly every weekend for the past year. My canvas rested on a cheap folding easel. My paint-stained backpack sat beside me. Tourists passed by. Joggers crossed the river walk. Most never looked twice. I was used to that. At 24 years old, I had learned that invisible people move through the world more easily. The paint on my sneakers was older than the sneakers themselves. My jacket had been repaired so many times that the stitching no longer matched. But when I painted, none of that mattered. Colors were cheaper than therapy and kinder than reality. That afternoon, I was working on a landscape of the river. At least, that was what it looked like to everyone else. What I was really painting was a memory. The curve of the water, the old bridge, the patch of sunlight touching the far bank. Every detail came from a photograph my father had taken years before he died. I never met anyone who understood why I painted it over and over again. Most people only saw a river. I saw the last place where my family had been whole. A gust of wind nearly knocked my easel sideways. I reached out quickly to steady it. When I looked up, a black luxury SUV had stopped near the curb above the river walk. It did not belong there. Neither did the man who stepped out of it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark overcoat that probably cost more than everything I owned. Several men remained near the vehicle, speaking quietly into earpieces. Bodyguards, I guessed. The stranger ignored them completely. Instead, he looked toward the river, toward me. I quickly returned my attention to the canvas. Men like that did not notice women like me. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Something felt strange. I glanced up again. He was still there, watching. Not me. The painting. His expression had not changed. Yet something about his eyes unsettled me. They looked familiar with the scene in front of him, like he recognized something he was not expecting to find. I dipped my brush into blue paint and forced myself to focus. The river moved quietly beneath the fading sunlight. Around me, the city continued its endless rush. But the stranger never left. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up one more time. Our eyes met across the distance. For a brief second, neither of us moved. Then his gaze shifted back to the canvas. Not to the river, not to the skyline, to one small detail hidden near the corner of the painting. A detail nobody had ever noticed before. My heart skipped, because the look on his face was not confusion. It was recognition. And in that moment, I realized the lonely man by the river knew something about my painting that I did not. The image stayed in my mind long after the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline. By the time I packed my brushes and folded my easel, the stranger and his black SUV were gone. I told myself it did not matter. People came and went every day. Wealthy businessmen, tourists, curious strangers. Yet something about the way he had looked at that small detail in my painting refused to leave me alone. The next morning, I woke before sunrise in the tiny apartment I rented above an old grocery store. The pipes rattled whenever the heat turned on. The kitchen window overlooked a brick wall. My alarm clock was 5 minutes fast because I could not afford to be late for work. I worked mornings at a neighborhood coffee shop and painted whenever I could. It was not the life I had imagined as a child, but it was the life I had. By noon, I was back near the river with a fresh canvas. The wind felt colder than the day before. Gray clouds drifted low across the water. I settled onto the same bench and began painting. An hour passed peacefully. Then a shadow fell across the edge of my canvas. My hand froze. I looked up. The stranger stood several feet away. Up close, he seemed even more intimidating. Tall, impeccably dressed, calm in a way that made everyone around him seem rushed and careless. His dark hair moved slightly in the wind. His blue eyes studied the painting with the same intensity as before. "You came back?" I heard myself say. The words escaped before I could stop them. A faint smile touched his face. "So did you." His voice was deeper than I expected. Controlled. Confident. We stood in silence for a moment. Most people asked how much I charged for paintings. He did not. Most people complimented the colors. He did not do that either. Instead, his gaze settled on the lower corner of the canvas, on a small detail hidden beside the bridge. A tiny red sailboat. I painted it in every version without thinking. It had appeared in my father's old photograph. "Where did you see that boat?" he asked quietly. A chill ran through me. Nobody had ever asked that question. It was in a picture my father took years ago, I replied. Why? The stranger looked toward the river. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. For the first time, he seemed less like a powerful man and more like someone remembering something painful. Because I remember it, he said. My heart skipped. You remember a boat? He nodded slowly. I remember that exact boat. The wind carried silence between us. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or be suspicious. Chicago was a huge city. Thousands of boats crossed the river every year. Yet he sounded certain, completely certain. Before I could ask another question, one of the men near the SUV approached him and spoke quietly. The stranger listened without looking away from the painting. Then he turned back to me. What is your name? He asked. Grace Bennett. He repeated it softly, as if testing whether he already knew it. Then he gave a single nod. I am Adrian. Nothing more. No last name. No explanation. Moments later, he walked away. I watched the SUV disappear into traffic. My brush remained motionless in my hand. Because as I looked down at the painting, I realized something impossible. The stranger had recognized a detail from a photograph that had never left my family's possession. The question followed me home that night and stayed there. I heard it while washing paint from my brushes. I heard it while counting the cash tips from the coffee shop. I heard it while staring at the cracked ceiling above my bed. How could a stranger recognize something from a photograph that had spent years inside a box beneath my closet floor? By morning, I still had no answer. The old coffee shop smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon when I arrived for my shift. The morning crowd rushed in and out carrying expensive phones and expensive schedules. Most never noticed the girl pouring their coffee. That was fine. I had learned a long time ago that people saw what they expected to see. They saw a tired waitress. They did not see the artist sketching on napkins during breaks. They did not see the stack of unpaid bills hidden in my apartment. They did not see the dreams that refused to die. Around noon, my manager handed me a small envelope. Somebody left this for you, he said. My stomach tightened immediately. Who? He shrugged. Tall guy? Expensive suit. Did not leave a name. My pulse quickened. I already knew. The envelope contained a simple business card. No company logo. No address. Only a phone number and a handwritten message. Keep painting. I stared at the words for several seconds. They should have felt strange. Instead, they felt oddly personal. Like encouragement from someone who understood exactly how difficult it had become to keep believing in myself. After work, I walked home through the cold Chicago afternoon. My apartment building looked even older in daylight. Peeling paint covered the hallway walls. The elevator had been broken for months. By the time I reached my third-floor unit, my legs ached. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I did every evening was check the small wooden box hidden beneath my bed. Most people would have considered it worthless. To me, it was everything. Inside were old photographs, faded letters, and my father's journal. The pages smelled faintly of dust and age. I opened the journal to a familiar section and studied one of the photographs again. The river, the bridge, the red sailboat. My father had taken it nearly 15 years ago. I turned the photo over. There was writing on the back that I had somehow never paid much attention to before. Just a date and a name. My breath caught. Adrian. I blinked and read it again. Adrian. The same name the stranger had given me beside the river. A chill moved slowly down my spine. Maybe it was a coincidence. Chicago was a large city. Thousands of men were probably named Adrian. Yet deep down, I knew it was not that simple. I looked at the photograph one more time, then at the name written on the back. For the first time since meeting the stranger, I realized something even more unsettling than before. Maybe Adrian had not recognized the painting by accident. Maybe he had been part of the memory all along. Rain tapped softly against my apartment window that evening as I spread the contents of the wooden box across the kitchen table. Photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, small pieces of a life that seemed farther away every year. My father had saved everything. He believed memories deserved protection. At the time, I thought it was sentimental. Now it felt important. The name written on the back of the photograph refused to leave my mind. Adrian. I turned the picture over again. The handwriting belonged to my father. I recognized the slight curve of the letters immediately. There was no mistake. Somehow, years before I met the stranger by the river, my father had known someone named Adrian. The question was why. I spent hours searching through old papers. Most contained ordinary things. Grocery lists, utility receipts, birthday cards. Then, near the bottom of the box, I found something I had never noticed before. A sealed envelope tucked between the pages of an old sketchbook. Dust covered the corners. My name was not written on it. Neither was my father's. Only a single word appeared across the front. Adrian. My pulse quickened. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. My father's handwriting filled both sides. I sat down before reading. The first few lines seemed harmless. Memories. Gratitude. References to events I did not understand. Then one sentence made my breath catch. Thank you for helping me when nobody else would. I read it twice. Then 3 times. My father rarely thanked anyone. He was proud and stubborn and determined to solve his own problems. Yet here he was expressing gratitude to a man named Adrian, a man who might be the same person I had met beside the river. I continued reading. The letter mentioned a promise, a friendship, a difficult time in both their lives. But before I could learn more, the final page was missing. Torn away years ago. I sat there staring at the incomplete letter, frustration building inside me. It felt like finding the first half of a map and losing the second. The next afternoon, I returned to the river earlier than usual. The sky hung low and gray above the city. Cold air drifted across the water. I set up my easel and pretended to focus on painting. In reality, I watched every passing car, every pedestrian, every shadow. An hour passed, then another. Just as I began feeling foolish, a familiar black SUV appeared near the curb. My heart immediately accelerated. Adrian stepped out alone this time. No bodyguards followed him. No assistants. Just him. He walked slowly toward the river and stopped beside my easel. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the old letter. His expression changed the moment he saw the handwriting. The calm certainty disappeared from his face, replaced by something deeper, something personal. Where did you get that? He asked quietly. I looked directly into his eyes. It belonged to my father. The river moved silently behind us. Wind tugged at the edges of the paper. Adrian stared at the letter as though it belonged to another lifetime. Then he whispered words that made my heart stop. I have been looking for that letter for 15 years. For a moment, the sounds of the city seemed to disappear. The river continued flowing behind us. Wind moved across the water. People walked past without noticing that my entire understanding of the past had just shifted. Adrian stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the letter in my hands. I had expected curiosity, maybe surprise. What I saw instead was something far deeper. Recognition, memory, regret. You knew my father, I said quietly. It was not really a question anymore. Adrian exhaled slowly. Yes. The answer felt heavier than I expected. 15 years of mystery reduced to a single word. I looked down at the letter again. The faded paper suddenly seemed more valuable than anything I owned. Then tell me who he was to you. Adrian glanced toward the river before answering. He was my friend. I almost laughed. The word felt too simple, too small. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the way he reacted to the painting, the photograph, and now the letter. People do not spend 15 years looking for a letter from someone who was just a friend, I said. For the first time, a faint smile appeared on his face. No, they do not. Silence settled between us again. Then Adrian surprised me. Instead of asking for the letter, he sat down on the empty bench beside my easel. The gesture felt strangely human. Not like a powerful man giving orders. Just a person carrying old memories. Your father and I met during a difficult period of my life, he said. Long before I became the man people know today. I listened carefully. He helped me when I had very little. His gaze remained on the river. Most people saw problems when they looked at me. Your father saw potential. The words stayed with me. They sounded exactly like something my father would do. He always believed people could become more than their circumstances. It was one of the reasons I missed him so much. Adrian looked toward my painting. That red sailboat belonged to an old fisherman who used to dock here every summer. My heart skipped. You really remember it? He nodded. I remember the day your father took that photograph. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through me. Suddenly, this was no longer a story from before I was born. It was real. Adrian had been there. He had seen it happen. He was part of the memory I had painted hundreds of times without knowing. A few moments later, One of the black SUVs pulled up near the curb. Adrian's driver waited respectfully inside. Yet Adrian made no move to leave. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a small photograph. The edges were worn from age. Carefully, he handed it to me. My breath caught immediately. The picture showed two younger men standing beside the river. One was Adrian. The other was my father. Both were smiling. The photograph trembled slightly in my hands. It was the first image I had ever seen of them together. On the back, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were 6 words that changed everything. Brothers are not always related by blood. I stared at the sentence as my pulse raced. Then I looked up at Adrian. And for the first time, I realized he had not come back to the river because of my painting. He had come back because my father had never truly left it. That photograph remained in my hands long after the sun disappeared behind the skyline. The river reflected hundreds of city lights, turning the water into ribbons of gold and silver. Adrian sat beside me in silence, giving me time to absorb what I had just learned. My father had spoken about friendship many times when I was young. He believed some people entered your life for a reason. Looking at the photograph, I finally understood what he meant. Why did he never tell me about you? I asked quietly. Adrian lowered his gaze. Because he promised he would not. The answer surprised me. Promised who? Me. Wind moved through the trees lining the river walk. Adrian leaned back against the bench and stared toward the dark water. When your father and I met, my life was complicated. He worried that staying connected to me might create difficulties for his family. We agreed that if circumstances ever changed, he would decide when to tell you. I looked down at the photograph again, but he never had the chance. Adrian nodded slowly. For a moment, sadness crossed his face. It was the first truly vulnerable expression I had seen from him, the kind that cannot be rehearsed or hidden. No, he said softly. He did not. We sat quietly for several minutes. Then Adrian surprised me again. Your father used to talk about your drawings. My head snapped toward him. What? A faint smile appeared. You were 6 years old when you filled an entire kitchen wall with crayons. Heat rushed to my face. I cannot believe he told you that. Adrian laughed quietly. The sound felt strangely warm. He was very proud of you. Those words hit harder than I expected. My father had been gone for years, yet somehow this stranger knew pieces of him that I had forgotten. Memories I thought had disappeared forever suddenly felt alive again. The cold evenings seemed less lonely. The river seemed less empty. There is something else, Adrian said after a while. His expression grew thoughtful. Your father wanted you to keep painting. My chest tightened. How do you know that? Adrian reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. Carefully, he handed it to me. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. My father's. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. It was a copy of a note written years earlier. Near the bottom was a sentence underlined twice. If Grace ever doubts herself, remind her that talent is a gift, but courage is a choice. My vision blurred. I blinked rapidly, trying not to cry in front of him. For years I had questioned every decision, every painting, every dream. Yet here was proof that my father had believed in me long before I learned how to believe in myself. Adrian stood slowly. The city lights reflected in his blue eyes. Keep the photograph, he said. It belongs with your family. Then he glanced at the unfinished canvas on my easel and finished the painting. I looked down at the river scene. For the first time, it no longer felt like a memory of something lost. It felt like the beginning of something I had finally found. As Adrian walked back toward the waiting SUV, I noticed something tucked into the corner of the copied note, a handwritten address, and beneath it, a sentence that made my heart race. When the time is right, show her what is inside the studio. The address stayed folded inside my jacket pocket for 3 days before I found the courage to use it. During those 3 days, I painted more than I had in months. Every brushstroke felt different now. The river no longer belonged only to memory. It belonged to answers. On the 4th afternoon, gray clouds drifted across Chicago, and a light rain darkened the sidewalks. I stood in front of an old brick building on the north side of the city, staring at the address written in my father's handwriting. The structure looked abandoned. Dust covered the windows. The faded sign above the entrance had lost most of its lettering years ago. Yet something about the place felt familiar. My pulse quickened as I unlocked the front door with the small key Adrian had given me the night before. The hinges groaned softly. Cool air greeted me as I stepped inside. For several seconds, I could see almost nothing. Then my eyes adjusted. My breath caught instantly. Paintings covered every wall. Hundreds of them. Landscapes, portraits, sketches, river scenes, city streets, sunsets, memories preserved in color and light. I moved slowly through the room, afraid that if I walked too quickly the entire place might disappear. Some paintings were unfinished. Others looked decades old. Near the back wall stood an easel surrounded by dried paint brushes. A faded jacket hung from a chair nearby. My chest tightened. It felt as though someone had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. Then I noticed a framed photograph sitting on a shelf. My father and Adrian stood together beside the river, both younger and smiling. Neither looked wealthy. Neither looked important. They looked happy. The realization hit me unexpectedly. Before Adrian became the powerful man everyone feared and respected, he had been someone's friend. My father's friend. A soft sound behind me broke the silence. I turned and found Adrian standing near the entrance. He had arrived without me noticing. His dark overcoat was damp from the rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "This was your studio?" I asked quietly. Adrian shook his head. "Ours." The answer echoed through the room. He walked toward an old work table and rested his hand on the worn wood surface. "Your father spent more time here than I did." I looked around again. "Why keep it all these years?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Because he told me one day someone would need it." My eyes drifted toward a stack of sketchbooks near the window. There were dozens of them. Years of work. Years of dreams. The kind of dreams people often abandon when life becomes difficult. Slowly, I opened the top sketchbook. The first page contained a note written in my father's familiar handwriting. "Grace, if you are reading this, then you finally found the place where hope survived." Tears blurred my vision immediately. I swallowed hard and continued reading. "Never let circumstances decide who you become. Create something beautiful anyway." My hands trembled. Adrian remained silent beside me. He understood that this moment belonged to my father. Yet as I looked around the studio, I realized something else. This was not only a gift from the past. It was an invitation. A chance to become the person my father had always believed I could be. And for the first time in years, that future no longer felt impossible. The studio changed everything. Over the following weeks, I spent every free hour there. Mornings at the coffee shop, afternoons by the river, evenings surrounded by canvases, sketchbooks, and memories that no longer felt lost. For the first time in years, my life seemed to move towards something instead of away from it. The old building became a second home. Sometimes I painted alone. Sometimes Adrian stopped by without warning. He never interrupted my work. He would simply sit near the window with a cup of coffee and watch the city lights appear beyond the glass. Strangely, the silence between us never felt uncomfortable. One evening, a spring storm rolled across Chicago. Rain tapped softly against the studio windows while I worked on a large canvas inspired by the river. Adrian stood nearby studying the finished sections. "Your father would have loved this one," he said quietly. I smiled without looking up. "You always say that." "Because it is true." There was no hesitation in his voice. I set my brush down and turned toward him. "Tell me something honestly." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "All right. Why did you really come back to the river that day?" For a moment, only the sound of rain filled the room. Adrian looked toward one of the old photographs hanging on the wall. The picture showed him and my father laughing beside the water years earlier. "Because I was tired," he admitted. The answer surprised me. "Tired of what?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Everything." He walked slowly through the studio, his gaze moving across the paintings. "Success is strange. People think it solves loneliness. Most of the time, it just hides it better." I listened quietly. "Then I saw your painting." He stopped beside the canvas I had been working on. For a moment, it felt like the past had returned. My chest tightened. I understood that feeling, more than I wanted to admit. Adrian looked at me. Then I realized it had not returned. His expression softened. It had grown into something new. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The storm continued outside. Rain traced patterns across the windows. Somewhere beyond the city, the river flowed through the darkness exactly as it always had. Then Adrian reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded envelope. "What is this?" I asked. "Something your father left with me." My pulse quickened immediately. Carefully, I opened it. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. The message was short, much shorter than I expected. "If you are reading this, Then you finally met Grace. Trust her. She sees the best in people even when they do not see it themselves. I looked up slowly. Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the letter. He wrote that years ago, he said. Emotion caught in my throat. Not because of the words. Because my father had somehow imagined this moment long before either of us knew it would happen. I read the note again. Then I noticed one final sentence written beneath the signature. A sentence neither Adrian nor I had mentioned before. One day, the river will bring the two of you back together. When it does, do not be afraid of what comes next. The note remained in my hands long after Adrian left the studio that night. Rain continued falling outside, but for the first time in years, the sound no longer felt lonely. Spring slowly turned into summer. The river changed color beneath brighter skies. The city seemed warmer. Somehow, so did my life. The old studio became a place of creation instead of memory. Every week, more paintings filled the walls. Every week, I found a little more confidence. Adrian never tried to control that journey. He simply showed up. Sometimes with coffee. Sometimes with quiet advice. Sometimes with nothing more than his presence. Looking back, I think that was what mattered most. He never treated me like someone who needed to be rescued. He treated me like someone worth believing in. By August, the gallery exhibition Adrian had quietly encouraged me to pursue was finally ready. The opening night arrived faster than I expected. My hands shook as guests filled the room. Strangers stopped in front of my paintings. They smiled. They asked questions. Some bought pieces. Others simply stood there staring at the river scenes that had once existed only inside my memories. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I found myself searching the crowd. Then I saw him. Adrian stood near the back of the gallery, wearing a dark suit, his hands in his pockets. He was not speaking to anyone. He was not drawing attention to himself. He was watching the paintings, the same way he had watched that first canvas beside the river. The realization made me smile. After the event ended, we walked outside together. The evening air felt warm. Chicago glowed beneath thousands of lights. Without saying a word, Adrian led me toward the river walk. We stopped at the exact place where everything had begun. The water reflected the skyline like liquid gold. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Adrian looked out across the river and laughed quietly. Your father would be insufferably proud right now. I laughed too. You really think so? He nodded. I know so. The answer carried no hesitation, only certainty, the kind that comes from love and loyalty surviving the passage of time. I looked toward the water, the same river, the same bridge, the same city, yet everything felt different, because I was different. The girl who once painted memories because she was afraid of losing them had finally learned how to create new ones. Adrian stood beside me, silent as always. Yet somehow, his silence felt like home. I reached into my bag and removed a small painting. It showed the river at sunset. Two figures stood near the water beneath the golden light. One looked toward the future. The other looked toward the past. Both belonged in the same story. Adrian studied it carefully. Then he smiled. A real smile. The kind I had rarely seen. You finished it, he said. I nodded. No. My gaze moved toward the city lights stretching endlessly ahead. I think it is just beginning. The river flowed quietly beside us as the sun disappeared beyond the skyline. Years earlier, my father had believed two paths would cross again one day. Standing there beside Adrian, I finally understood something beautiful. Sometimes destiny does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits patiently beside a river until two people are ready to recognize what was meant to be there all along.